Hello everyone, and thank you for checking out my video. Patch 1.000.4 just came out for Helldivers 2. It includes visible supply lines and attack origins in the Galactic War, Stratagem, weapon planet, and enemy balancing updates, various crash fixes, stability improvements, and other updates. It also includes invite-only lobby creations. The goal with Stratagem balance is to make weaker stratagems more viable and possibly add more variety in loadouts. They also changed them to be more consistent, but keep them in a similar or higher power level. For the Rocket Sentry, they decrease the spread, prioritize larger targets, increase target distance from 75 to 100, decrease rockets per salvo from 2 to 1 for better ammo economy, increase explosion radius from 1 meter to 4 meters, decrease explosion armor penetration. Explosion can no longer damage heavy armored enemies. The projectile still has enough armor penetration to damage heavily armored targets. The projectile still has enough AP to damage heavily armored targets. Increased projectile damage from 200 to 300, so overall a buff. The old intent was to saturate an area with rockets, but it made it too inconsistent against medium and larger enemies. We want to make it more consistent against medium and larger enemies and give it better ammo economy to separate it from the autocannon sentry that has a higher damage output but can waste ammo by shooting targets that are already dead. For the Machine Gun Sentry, they reduced the cooldown from 180 seconds to 120 seconds. The Machine Gun Sentry felt like a worse version of the Gatling Sentry, and we wanted it to have a different place in the toolbox. We lowered the cooldown to make it more viable and more useful when changing positions often. As for the turrets or sentries, they increased the durability from 0% to 80%. The sentry turrets in the game were a little too easily killed by the bullets flying in chaotic situation. We have increased the durability factor of the turrets to make them more resistant to small arms fire. For the heavy machine gun emplacement, they increased the rotation speed by 100%. The heavy machine gun placement is intended to be a way of defending a fixed position, but due to its immobility and the drawback that presents, the slow rotation speed was a bit too much of an additional drawback. Therefore, we have increased the rotation speed significantly. The anti-personnel minefield increased explosion damage from 250 to 350. Incendiary mines increase explosion damage from 150 to 210. The minefields are supposed to be a strong but volatile way of blocking off certain approaches for a limited time. They are currently not very good at filling this role, and we will be looking more at them in the future. For now, we are increasing the damage to at least improve their effectiveness against targets that trigger them. Orbital Gatling increased fire rate by 25%, increased rounds per salvo from 30 to 60, increased armor penetration, can damage heavy armored enemies. Decreased cooldown from 80 seconds to 70 seconds. The Orbital Gatling Barrage was not effective at dealing with any specific target. We wanted to be better at saturating the target area and also be able to do damage against heavy armored units. It is still not very likely to outright kill heavily armored targets, but should be able to soften them up a bit. We also lowered the cooldown to make it more available and to make it more competitive in comparison to Eagle Stratagems. For the Orbital Precision Strike, one of my favorites, decreased cooldown from 100 to 90 seconds, decreased spawn or call-in time from 4 to 2 seconds. That 2-second call-in time is actually insane. I could see myself running towards under the Bile Titan, throwing the Stratagem, and continue running, and the Precision Strike would hit the Bile Titan while it's trying to turn. Even the spit animation, I think it's longer than the call-in time now. Players should really try out the Orbital Precision Strike. It's even better now. It can even take out certain objectives, like the Rogue Science Facility and tower detectors. The Orbital Precision Strike's original intent was to be used against spawners and fixed positions. However, this hasn't stopped the community from using it against pretty much everything. I'm one of them. Therefore, you want to make it a little easier to use against moving targets by lowering the call-in time. We also lower the cooldown to make it more available and to make it more competitive compared to the Eagle Stratagems. For the Orbital Airburst Strike, they decreased the cooldown from 120 to 100 seconds. The Orbital Airburst's original intent was to block an area for a short duration and kill most non-heavy armored enemies in the area. It was underperforming compared to other anti-chaff options and had a very low rate of use. Oh really? This was my main anti-bug breach stratagem until they fixed the dot. Now I use the Orbital Gas Strike. To make it more attractive option, we lowered the cooldown, which also made it more competitive in comparison to Eagle Stratagems. For the Eagle 110mm rocket pods, while these changes may look like a straight-up nerf, that is not the intention. Improved targeting, increased projectile armor penetration now does 100% damage to heavily armored enemies instead of 50%. Decreased projectile damage from 600 to 250 to compensate for the improved targeting and extra damage from the increased armor penetration. Decreased explosion armor penetration. Explosion can no longer damage heavily armored enemies. The Eagle rocket pods were very inconsistent in dealing with its main targets, heavily armored enemies. The changes we are making aim to make it more consistent at dealing with these targets, but it will still not be a surefire way of outright killing them. It should, however, always soften up a target in some way. We are interested in hearing feedback on how this feels now and are open to tweaking them further. Eagle Strafing Run. Increased uses from 3 to 4. Increased armor penetration can now damage heavily armored enemies. The Eagle Strafing Run is supposed to be a tool to effectively deal with small groups of medium armored enemies. To that end, we have increased its armor penetration to be able to reliably penetrate medium armored targets and soften up heavily armored enemies. For the grenade launcher, they increased the explosion damage from 350 to 400. The grenade launcher is intended to be good at softening up hordes of enemies and provide utility for destroying spawners. While it is good at destroying spawners and explosion was a little too weak to reliably damage medium enemies, the change in its explosion damage should put it in a better place when it comes to dealing with hordes and more effective against some medium armored enemies. For the heavy machine gun, increased projectile damage from 100 to 150, increased projectile damage against durable body parts from 23 to 33%, decreased fire rate from 450, 750, 900 to 450, 600, 750, decreased reload time from 7 to 5.5 seconds, increased stagger strength. The heavy machine gun failed to deliver on the fantasy of a heavy machine gun when it was released. It had a weak round with low damage and impact. While the fire rate was up in levels more likely seen on smaller machine guns, the heavy machine gun intent is to be a great option at dealing with medium armored enemies and should chew them up easily, similar to the heavy machine gun emplacement. We are lowering the rate of fire further to resemble the fire rate seen in contemporary weapons of similar type, and increasing the damage and stagger so each hit is significant. This should also make the available ammo last longer. For the machine gun, they decreased the reload time from 4 to 3.5 seconds and increased the max amount of magazines from 3 to 4. The intent of the machine gun was that it should be a great crowd clear weapon with the ability to tackle medium armored enemies. The drawbacks of the machine gun are that you have to sit still while reloading, and this made it hard to compete with a stalwart's mobility. Therefore, we want to lean into its strengths and reduce its drawbacks slightly to improve the value proposition of the weapon. To that end, we are lowering the reload time and giving it additional magazine. It is also receiving a buff to damage. For the machine gun sentry, Gatling sentry, and Exo-45 Patrol Suit Gatling gun, they're increasing the projectile damage from 80 to 90, increased projectile damage against durable body parts from 7.5% to 25%. Family of machine gun stratagems that use the 8mm rifle round were underperforming slightly, and we have therefore increased the damage slightly. The Liberator, Stalwart, and Guard Dog have increased projectile damage against durable body parts from 10% to 23%. The Liberator Concussive increased projectile damage against durable body parts from 23% to 35%. Regarding durable damage for rifle calibers, small arm fires in-game does less damage to durable body parts. However, many small arms were doing the same damage percentage-wise, not representing the larger impact of a rifle-type round would have compared to other types. Therefore, rifle-type bullets are now slightly more effective against durable body parts. These changes affect the Liberator, Stalwart, Guard Dog, Liberator Concussive, Diligence, Adjudicator, Tenderizer, Machine Gun Sentry, Gatling Sentry, and Exo-45 Patrol Exosuits Gatling. Durable body parts are in general body parts that have high amount of mass with non-vital organs or a lot of empty space. The idea is to simulate that a single bullet has a high chance of not dealing significant damage. In general, the higher caliber weapon, the better the effect is against durable body parts. Explosions also have a very high effectiveness against durable body parts as shockwaves ripple through whatever you are hitting. Some weapons are more effective than others or have special exceptions, though this should follow the same logic as above. Basically, this is a buff when you're not hitting the weak spot of an enemy when using a specific weapon. For the Adjudicator, they increased the magazine capacity from 25 to 30, increased projectile damage against durable body parts from 10% to 20%. The Adjudicator with relatively few rounds in each magazine combined with a wild recoil left players no room for error, which didn't feel good for an assault rifle type weapon. The increased magazine capacity should make the weapon more forgiving of mistakes and encourage a more aggressive playstyle. Remember, short controlled bursts. For the Tenderizer, which is a weapon I'm excited about, they increased the projectile damage from 60 to 95, increased projectile damage against durable body parts from 10 to 17%, decreased ammo capacity from 35 to 30, decreased number of magazines from 10 to 8. They also increased the stagger strength. The Tenderizer was released in a non-representative state as it used the incorrect stats, didn't have its own niche, and it felt like a worse Liberator. We are restoring justice and bringing it back to its intended design, which is a very precise assault rifle that rewards high accuracy play by having a heavy hitting round that doesn't penetrate medium armor. With that 95 damage buff, I can forgive them for not giving it a medium armor penetration. For the Purifier, they increased the projectile armor penetration to be the same as the explosion. They also decreased the explosion damage falloff, so overall it got a buff. The original idea behind the Purifier was to create a Scorcher variant with a charge-up mechanic. Unfortunately, since the projectile didn't have enough armor penetration against medium armored enemies, even a direct hit didn't deal enough damage to justify its long charge-up time. By increasing the armor penetration of the projectile and reducing the damage falloff of the explosion, we hope to make it an exotic option that is viable in capable hands. For the explosive crossbow, they increased the explosion armor penetration to be the same as the projectile. Increased demolition strength, it can now destroy bug holes and bot fabricator buildings. They also added medium penetration tag. Similarly to the Purifier, the crossbow's bolt didn't always deal its full damage due to the explosion having lower armor penetration than the projectile. Making both the projectile and the explosion penetrate medium armor should make the crossbow more consistent against medium-sized targets and increase its AoE viability. For the Eruptor, they increased the total damage from 420 to 570 damage per shot. In one of the previous patches, they removed the shrapnel from the explosion as it made the Eruptor's ability to spike damage too much for a primary weapon, and for a support weapon even, and introduced some unexpected interactions. We acknowledge that the Eruptor lost a good portion of its capabilities and additional damage boosts didn't make up for the loss of shrapnel. It wasn't just damage it lost, it also lost its uniqueness and identity. Granted, the shrapnel system had its issues, but that's what made the Eruptor so unique. Adding back shrapnel is quite tricky because of the low visibility of shrapnel, which sometimes created situations where you or your fellow Helldivers died with very little feedback of what killed you. To compensate for that, we're giving the Eruptor 150 more damage per explosion to make it more consistent without introducing new edge cases. The intent is that this change will make the Eruptor viable both against medium armored targets and group of cannon fodder enemies. For the Diligence, they increased the projectile damage against durable body parts from 10% to 25%. They also updated the Recoil Stance modifiers to be more consistent and reward for being prone more. Almost all of them will improve the recoil and only 2 have been made worse, and only by 10%. Percentages show how much of the weapon recoil was applied in different scenarios and the new values. For a third person, when standing stationary it's still 100%, moving is still 150%. When crouching, stationary is now 60%, moving is now 100%. When scope, standing, stationary is now 90%, moving is now 110%, crouch, stationary 60%, moving 90%. When prone, stationary is now 40%. For gameplay, they removed the Operation Modifier AA Defenses, which reduces the Stratagem slots by 1. They disabled the Retrieve Essential Personnel Defend Event mission for the time being. Super samples can now spawn in difficulty 6. The CAF Artillery Stratagem is no longer blocked by Stratagem Jammers or Ion Storms, and it is available after the mission timer ends and the destroyer leaves close orbit. Enemies in melee range of the gates in the Evacuate High Value Asset mission will now attack it more consistently. Added the ability to chat from in-game menus and mission loading screen. Updated some first-person crosshairs to improve readability. Invite-only lobbies are now supported. New armor passive peak physique, 50% melee damage, and 30% weapon ergonomics. This will come in the new War Bond. Planets and hazards. The spike plant that appears on certain planets have been reworked. No longer causes bleed or stamina drain if hit by the plant explosion or spikes. Now pops 3 times, sending spikes everywhere and dealing increased damage. Fire tornadoes have had their behavior changed. They should no longer feel like they actively respond to player movement and should move more randomly. While a fire tornado storm takes place, enemy vision is reduced, player vision is unaffected. Fire tornadoes being more random should result in more variance in situation players find themselves in. Tornadoes are significantly less likely to pile up and overlap on extraction points or objectives, and will generally be a bit easier to deal with. Tremors had their spawning tweaked to be slightly more random. Tremors have their epicenter size and effect range increase. These changes should result in more situations where enemies away from the player get stunned, as well as reducing how consistently the player has tremor occur next to them. For visibility, a lot of planets have their fog amounts tweaked to be a bit less harsh and dense, to provide less fatigue from constantly fighting on planets with bad visibility. We still intend to there be foggy planets with worse visibility, but balance will be a bit off. Artificial light sources have their intensity rebalanced and reduced across the board to fix situations of lights completely blinding the player. The unexploded malfunction in hell bombs had sometimes be found on planets will now explode immediately if hit with a strong explosion or heavy weaponry. They will still have the same delay if hit by small arms fire or weaker attacks. Vegetations that large enough to slow the player now has an extra function. When inside the vegetation, Helldivers will be harder to detect, reducing their detection range by enemies. This effect stacks with other detection reducing effects such as nighttime, being crouched or prone, or things such as scout armor passive. For ion storms, they added additional VFX. For enemy changes, the acid effect applied by hunters, bug mines, and such now allows you to sprint while under the effect and slow you by 30% instead of 50%. Duration has been increased from 3 to 4 seconds. These changes are intended to make it less punishing for players to be slowed while fighting the Terminids. This allows us to use it in more places without making the experience very punishing, for example the Bile Spewers. For armored enemy balance, they have toned down the amount of heavily armored enemies like Bile Titans Chargers on higher difficulties and instead spawn more horde of smaller enemies. The difference should be quite noticeable, and the amount should be at least 30% less than before during bug breaches. We have also toned down slightly how many hulks that spawn for the automatons. Our intent is to ease up on the demand of anti-tank weapons, and by having more of the other enemies give a better incentive for the group to bring stratagems and weapons that take care of hordes. Patrol spawning is now back how it worked before patch 1.000.3, with some slight tweaks so that levels are less empty if you are far away from important locations with enemy presence. Stunning. Medium and large size enemies now don't get stunned as easily. This will not affect the stratagems that stun, and it will mostly just affect how easily the pummeler can stun larger enemies. I knew that pummeler nerf was coming, and justified. Terminids. For Bile Spewers and Nursing Spewers will now get slowed if they lose their legs. Spewer Puke now applies the acid effect. Spewer Puke can now only damage Helldivers up to 4 times per second, and the Helldiver cannot take damage multiple times from the same projectile. This should reduce the instances where you are instantly killed by it. For Bile Titan, the head is slightly less durable against weaker anti-tank weapons. It is not a large change and will mostly matter for weapons like the Railgun. The Bile Titan's Puke also has the 4 times per second damage limiter and cannot take damage multiple times from the same projectile. Their Puke now also has a bigger spread. Charger Behemoth is now joining the battle on higher difficulties. It can now also take more damage than before. This enables us to spawn fewer chargers but still retain the difficulty. Chargers will now only show bleed out effects from the body if the bleed out state has started. It can still show bleed out effects from the mouth without having started the bleed out state. For automatons, the Hulk Scorcher's flamethrower now does less damage and cannot damage the Helldivers for more than 4 times per second. In addition, the Helldiver can't be damaged multiple times by the same flame projectile. So same with the Puke changes. For automaton tanks, the armor value on the front has been lowered to be the same as the non-vent section on the rear of the tank. The intent was initially that it was supposed to be more armored in the front, but the visual language did not show that. The vents on the back of the tank turret still has the same armor value as before, but will check for explosion directions correctly now. Damage of exploding automaton jump packs has been decreased by 50%. It will still set you on fire though. For the Galactic War, they are introducing warp links, which are supply lines and origin of attacks. Supply lines were previously not shown on the Galactic War map to reduce clutter and improve readability. However, based on the feedback from our community, we have made an implementation showing them on the map. This solution tries to maintain the general readability while still exposing the system to players in-game. You will now also be able to see which planet an attack is originating from, potentially allowing for the community to stop the attack at its source. We have also updated the visuals in the sector and planet info pop-ups. As for the fixes and known issues, I will flash them on the screen and pause the video if you want to read them. I will also leave links below for the patch notes and the explained version for said patch notes below. I wasn't planning on making a video about this patch. I originally planned to do the Warband review video and start making build videos again, but they delayed the release of the new Warband by 4 hours to allow the new patch to settle in, since it is a hefty patch. Tell me your thoughts of the new patch. I hope this video was helpful and thank you for watching. Bye!